Hi everybody, Dr. Kat Vlies here again in video B of the lymphatic system. Here we're going to focus on the various vessels that help form the lymphatic organ system. So lymph is formed at the level of the capillary beds, as you know, by means of bulk fluid flow. And that lymph is collected by lymph capillaries. They have a very similar structure to blood capillaries. There are some differences. We'll take a look at that later on. All of this lymph then will start to merge into bigger vessels that we can refer to as lymphatic collecting vessels. And they even have valves inside of them, very similar to our bigger veins. And these lymphatic collecting vessels are going to direct a lot of the lymph through our lymph nodes, and our lymph nodes are responsible for filtering lymph. From there, we then form bigger and bigger vessels that we can call trunks, and then the trunks merge to collect the lymph in two ducts, lymph ducts, and we will see what they are called in the next slides. Let's first focus on the anatomy of the capillaries of the lymphatic system. For one, they're going to be very intertwined with the blood capillaries, which makes sense because the lymph is going to arise from the blood plasma that's filtered out. Notice though that our lymphatic capillaries are different from the blood capillaries in that they are like they have a dead end, or they are blind ended, right? Which is different from our capillaries, which receive blood from an arterial end and then they send the blood into a venual end. That is not the case for our lymphatic capillaries. Not only that, the lymphatic capillaries are even more permeable than the blood capillaries, and they have little mini valves, and we will see them better on the next slide. But even when the pressure in the interstitial fluid rises, those little mini valves ensure that our walls of our lymphatic capillaries remain very permeable. So let's take a closer look at the anatomy of the walls of our lymphatic capillaries and talk more about these little mini valves I mentioned a moment ago. So if we focus on just a small component of a lymphatic capillary here sitting amidst cells that have been nourished by a capillary bed, in between the cells, the interstitial fluid is collected that then will seep into our lymphatic capillary. So let's now go to this much more enlarged image, and there's a lot labeled here. So let's go through it step by step. First of all, if we go back to our picture that is not zoomed in, all of these yellowish areas, that is where we see our tissue cells, and they may have some collagen fibers or other fibers in their matrix. So all of these guys with the nuclei are tissue cells. The blue represents the fluid in between our tissue cells, so therefore the interstitial fluid, which is going to seep into our lymphatic capillaries, which are illustrated here by means of these lymphatic and the endothelial cells. So we see that the simple squamous epithelial tissue that forms the walls of lymphatic capillaries can also be referred to as endothelium or lymphatic endothelium, or the endothelium of lymphatic capillaries. Now notice that this endothelial layer is created or is formed to have little valves that allow for fluid, interstitial fluid, to very easily seep in into the lumen of our lymphatic capillary. Even as the pressure in the interstitial fluid rises, the pressure of that fluid will be such that it pushes the valves to where the fluid can seep in. On the other hand, when the fluid starts to collect inside of our lymphatic capillary, and the pressure now begins to rise inside of the lymphatic capillary, the valves work such that there is no backflow possible. So the fluid can easily enter, but the way the valves are formed is such that the fluid cannot easily get out. And therefore, we refer to them as one-way gates, these little valves. So they allow for interstitial fluid to easily move inward, but as the fluid collects on the inside of our lymphatic capillaries, they literally push up against those little valves to where they close off the whole opening that they normally create when they're open. As mentioned before, our lymph is made up of pretty much the same things as our blood plasma. In addition to that, we're going to have cells, particularly white blood cells, but especially during inflammation, we'll see that our lymph capillaries all pick up all kinds of cell particles because the cells are dying, are being killed, pathogens, all kinds of pathogens, and even cancer cells, depending on what kinds of inflammation we're looking at. This lymph then is passed on via the lymphatic vessels to lymph nodes, which will literally survey, I should say, all of this lymph with the help of very specialized cells that we will get to in another video. Now, in the small intestine, we have some modifications of the lymph capillaries and the lymphatic vessels. So if we draw the wall of the small intestine, let's say, I'm going to make an attempt to draw a three-dimensional structure here. Then if we'd blow up a small area right here of the small intestine and enlarge that, we would see that the inner lumen under the microscope is very convoluted. So this is under the microscope, and we would see that the lumen is very, very much like this. And we refer to these finger-like projections as villi, or one villus. Let me use a different color to encircle one villus. So here's the villus, and this would be where all the food is being digested in the lumen. Okay, so if we now grab one of these villi and isolate it, we see it here now. And again, it is going to be made up of simple columnar epithelium. Remember, that's what we find in the stomach and the small intestine and the large intestines lining. Mixed in, we have a bunch of goblet cells. And then we see that inside of each villus is where our connective tissue is located. So if I add where we find our nutrients are sitting here that we ate and that are being digested. So they're now small enough particles to where they can cross that epithelial layer and make it into our bloodstream. And of course, we call that absorption. But some of those nutrients, and particularly in the small intestine, lipids are going to, or fats, I should say, are going to also be absorbed into these lymphatic capillaries, which have a unique name in the small intestine. We call them lacteals. And all of those lacteals will eventually form the beginning of a substantially sized duct that you see here. And the beginning of that duct is enlarged, like so. And we call it the cisterna chyli. Remember, cisterna is another way of referring to a storage side. It's a storage site for the chyli, cisterna chyli or chyli, because the chyle is what we call the fatty like lymph that is absorbed into this part of our lymphatic system. So lymphatic capillaries are very thinly walled, made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue called endothelium, I should say, just like our blood capillaries. The bigger vessels, the lymphatic collecting vessels, are very similar to veins. So we're going to see the three typical tunics. Remember your tunica intima, your tunica media and externa. They have valves. They're even more thinner walled than the veins, and there's even more anastomosis than we see in the case of the veins. We find lymphatic collecting vessels traveling along superficial veins in the skin. And if we go and take a look at the deeper vessels, then the lymphatic vessels travel along with the arteries. So superficial to the body, we find that lymphatic vessels tend to follow veins, but deeper in the body, they tend to follow arteries. If the vessels, the lymphatic collecting vessels, get thicker and thicker walled, they are also going to have a vasa vasorum, just like the thicker uh, blood vessels do as well. And remember what this means, vessels within vessels. So we're going to see that there are little blood vessels present in the wall of the bigger collecting vessels of the lymphatic system. So towards the end of its path, lymph is going to become part of one of two lymphatic ducts. And we can call them the right and the left lymphatic ducts, or we can call them the right lymphatic duct, so same name, and thoracic duct. So the thoracic duct is the synonym for the left lymphatic duct. So again, your left lymphatic duct can also be called the thoracic duct. Now, when we take a look at what these ducts drain, and when I say what, I mean which regions, then notice that your right lymphatic duct is going to only drain the right side of the head, the right upper limb, and the right thorax. So everything in the purple here is drained into the right lymphatic duct. That right lymphatic duct will then drain, let me use a better color, will then drain into our right subclavian vein. On the other hand, the thoracic duct has a much wider draining region. It is going to drain everything else. So the upper left arm, the lower limbs, the abdominal pelvic region, and the other side of the thorax and the other side of the head. All that lymph will then enter via the thoracic duct or via the lymphatic duct, either way, into our left subclavian vein. So the right and the left subclavian veins, they are the ones that collect all of the lymph in the body, and they're of course going to merge with the brachiocephalic veins and then return the blood with that lymph to the heart's right atrium.